Hello, and welcome to episode 45 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. I'm Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
This is Jon Denning in Los Angeles.
John, how are things in Los Angeles today?
Things are pretty good here, but I think it's more important we focus on you, birthday boy.
It is indeed my birthday, which is why we're recording this episode in the afternoon as opposed to the usual evening. But the good news is this is not going to stop us from drinking since it's my birthday.
Oh yeah, if anything, this could overindulge. We'll see.
That'll happen later. What are you drinking today?
So, given the topic, which is our first discussion on how to get faster at logic games, you and I have taken slightly different approaches to this particular idea, to this notion. I went for a drink based around the notion of speed. In fact, specifically, it's called a Speedy Gonzales. But here's where things got interesting for me. Apparently, there are two different versions of this drink, and I couldn't decide which of the two I wanted. You can guess what happened.
You made both.
I made both, yeah.
Excellent.
Although one I made as an actual drink, tequila and Red Bull, which makes a degree of sense. And the other I made as like a tiny little sipper thing, which is Bailey's and Amaretto.
Which sounds delicious.
Yeah, the tequila and Red Bull, I obviously am a little more of a fan of.
No, that sounds disgusting to me.
Well, because it's your birthday, I'll let you have that opinion.
Excellent.
What are you drinking?
Well, we actually have played on the same theme, and because we're going to talk about getting faster at these games, you went for the Speedy Gonzales. I went for a drink called the Lava Flow, which is something where you slow it down a little bit. And we're going to use both those ideas as we talk through this topic. But this is actually a drink that I don't know that I have it frequently, but I always enjoy it when I see it on a menu or I'm at the type of place where I could order this without them like getting mad.
Yeah, I've definitely seen this drink at like a hotel pool or something.
And that's exactly the kind of place you would get it at. Or if you're vacationing someplace tropical or Hawaii or what have you. But the way they make this drink is they take some regular rum like Bacardi, then they add Malibu to it, and then strawberries, throw it in a blender, mix it all up until it's not, it's smooth, but it has some consistency to it. And then they put that in a glass. Then they take a banana of whatever size with pineapple juice and coconut cream and ice. And then you blend all of that together. So in the glass, you've kind of got this red bottom half of it. Then you take this other mixture, which has got a little bit of chunkiness to it, and you slowly pour it over the top of that. And so what happens is it kind of like the white stuff comes down like lava into the red portion at the bottom.
It's really cool looking. Now, confession time. Did you make this drink, or did the wife?
Of course not.
Did the wife?
Amanda made this.
Yeah.
Why would I, leave it in my amateur hands when the professional can like stroll in and be like, all right. I will say this. She was like, it's like 3:00. You seriously drinking this now? And I was like, that is the correct answer. Correct. I am drinking it now.
It is my birthday.
Which she was aware of it. She's like, well, it's your birthday, so you go ahead and do that.
Well, I feel like the birthday celebration started a little early this year because not only are you having a 3 p.m. drink, but you spent the last week seeing some really cool music.
Yeah, the last time we had an episode, the music that we used was Tove Lo, who I'd seen at the end of February. And this time I actually saw 2 shows back to back, which were both The Struts as the headliner and then Starcrawler as the opener. And that's notable because the song of this episode is Starcrawler's Bet My Brains. And even that is thematically consistent because you're going to have to use your brain to get better at logic games. You're going to have to work, but your brain is going to be a big part of it. But I will say the 2 concerts that I saw, if you get a chance to go see them both, do it. The Struts are always amazing. The show I saw in Santa Cruz was one of the best I've ever seen from them.
Yeah.
They've reached a level of professionalism and ability that just is jaw-dropping every time I watch them. The night before in San Francisco, they hadn't been quite as sharp as they were in Santa Cruz. Or another interpretation is I had a lot more to drink the night before.
You weren't quite as sharp.
I do know this, that when I got up the next morning, my throat was slightly raw, and I was like, I must have been singing along with the music.
There you go, as you should. I'm not as familiar with Starcrawler as the Struts, but I do like this song.
Yeah, the thing about them is they're super young.
Yeah.
They're a band that started when they were 15 in LA. She's from a really artsy family. It was a bunch of high school friends, and now they're a couple of years on from that. I think the San Francisco show for them was great. It was a really good crowd who knew a lot of their songs. It didn't feel obscure. In Santa Cruz, the scene was totally different. The crowd was much older.
Interesting.
And at one point, she said, "Hey, I know it's past your bedtimes, but don't be afraid to dance." And then later on, she could tell she was getting mad. She said, "You guys can turn up your hearing aids."
Oh, wow.
She was aggressive. But she did something that I thought was really interesting that I haven't often seen. They started the show with the band playing, and she was nowhere to be seen. She came through the crowd to get on stage, and then the crowd ended up kind of carrying her on stage. And then at the end of the show, when they were done, and they closed with this song, Bet My Brains, which has got a great video if you haven't seen it. It's very unusual. She crawled off the stage and out through the crowd, and it was like she was having a spasm. Of course, it was all an act. Yeah. But the crowd was like, "Help her!" It was just a really unusual kind of scene. And we were fortunate because I made friends with a couple of people at the venue who turned out to be really cool. And so afterwards, I ended up talking to the band. I sent you a picture.
Yeah, I saw the picture. I couldn't believe how tall she was.
Yeah, she's rail thin and like 6'4". It's a very, like, she's taller than me. I'm 6'2". And I was like, wow, you actually are taller than me. I didn't think that was going to be the case. So awesome set of shows. I could probably talk about it forever, but I know that everybody's like, yeah, that's cool, man. Let's move on.
Well, we'll have more chances to address this subject in future episodes, so maybe we can come back to it.
More shows to come.
There you go. In the meantime, what's going on in the LSAT world?
Well, something that might affect my shows and is certainly starting to affect people taking this test, if not just their workplaces, but the schools that they're at. Yeah. That is the coronavirus. And if you've been paying attention to the LSAC website, you may have noticed that they have started to address the coronavirus situation. And there's a couple different things. They put up a page that we can link to. They've canceled tests largely in Asia. South Korea, Thailand, Japan, Hong Kong, the Chinese mainland, all those tests have been canceled now for the next administration. And I think China had asked them to postpone the tests in a couple of months, conceivably, or at least not open registration. So they've been very aggressive. Domestically, the thing that they have done is they have not canceled any LSATs yet. We'll talk about that in a second. But they have extended some deadlines and waived test date change fees for the March LSAT. So if you're concerned about the situation with the virus and you don't feel as if it's worth taking the LSAT for, you can switch to a later test, whether it's April, June, or July, by Friday, March 20th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are no charges for that.
Yeah, just over a week from when this is likely to come out and be live. So
exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good thing. They made another change as well, which was that they have revised the test day rules. And I think this is a really smart change for them. Mm-hmm. You now can bring in nose and face masks, and you can bring hand sanitizer into the test center as well. Yeah. So if you feel like, look, I want to have 100% safety here, or at least as close to 100% as you can get. Nothing's 100%.
Right.
You can now do that as well. So I think that is really good in terms of the steps that they're taking. And they talk about we are monitoring it. And this is interesting because I know we've been asked this question as well at PowerScore. What are you guys doing?
Right.
The first thing is we're monitoring it. We've posted notices across our website in our student centers. We've talked to our instructors about what will happen. The situation is different in different cities. New York is going to be different than what you see in Kansas City. And Kansas City is going to be different than what you see in San Diego.
Sure.
So we're using the local health advisements and advisories to make decisions. I will say this. We are extremely well positioned so that if we are forced to postpone or suspend in-person classes, we can go online instantaneously.
Yeah, there would be no setbacks, delays, no issues at all.
Yeah.
The utmost safety. I mean, I know you and I aren't always operating with an abundance of caution, but in this regard, we very much are.
That's exactly the case.
Yeah.
I mean, I just went to a couple of concerts that were packed with people.
Yeah. On a personal level, we're probably not being as smart as we could, but for our students and instructors' sakes, we're going to err on the side of overly safe.
Yeah, so if we need to shift classes online, we can do that instantly. It's a really easy interface for us to work with. And you're seeing that across the nation with some universities right now. People are being proactive about it. We're certainly going to do the same. So if you are out there and you're one of our students, whether you're a tutoring student, whether you're an in-class, in-person student, call us if you have questions. We're happy to talk to you about it and at least address it. Obviously, if you're in a live online class or an on-demand class, you're good.
Yeah, just stay home.
Yeah, just stay home and keep studying.
Right.
So the other question I think that we've been getting is, do you think that LSAC will cancel the March or April LSATs or both? And if they do, will that affect admissions?
Yeah. And that's a tough thing to predict, obviously. I mean, if anything, what we're seeing right now with the nature of this virus is it's constantly in flux. I'm seeing articles day to day that change my opinion of it. And I'm sure LSAC is monitoring those same news reports and epidemiological, I guess is how you'd say that, reports.
That's it.
Thanks. So, yeah, I mean, we're all keeping our finger to the pulse of this as best we can, but the pulse is changing.
Yeah, I think that's the real key point is that do we know whether or not that's going to happen in terms of test cancellation? No, we don't know. Is it possible? It is possible. There's no doubt that they may come out and say March test is not going to be held.
Yeah.
Are they going to hold it 2 weeks later? No. If they cancel it, they will push everybody into a later LSAT. They won't make it up in a week or 2 weeks. And that's part of the benefit of the fact that in years past, there was no March LSAT.
Right.
There was no April LSAT. We didn't have these options sitting here. There was just February and then June. So in one sense, we are dealing with extra tests compared to what has been the prior norm. However, let's just say for a moment that they do cancel the March LSAT. And again, I don't know if they are going to do that. It certainly seems like it's possible, but uncertain. That would have an effect on admissions. There are a number of schools out there that are waiting on March or will be waiting on March LSAT results to make certain decisions about, like, do I admit this person? If they've put somebody on the wait list, they might use those results to make that kind of calculation. And so they're waiting on spring results and certainly planning on using them. If it turns out that March gets canceled, I think what you'd see from law schools is they'll say, all right, let's use April.
Yeah.
And so a single cancellation here in March would not be the end of the world. If both March and April get canceled, it's a bit more of a problem. And I think what schools would then say is we need to push decisions back and let people know that it might be a little bit later than expected, simply because we're dealing with an extraordinary public health crisis. So give us some latitude.
Yeah. WHO pandemic as of this morning. They officially labeled it. So
yeah. And I think, if you call them up and you're mad about it, there's nothing they can do. In law school, you'll learn about something called force majeure, and that's exactly what this is. These are events that are out of their control that are affecting far more than just LSAC or, us or what have you. So everybody's trying to do their best at this point.
Yeah, I realize that this is all still speculative, but what do you think? Do you think that there's a greater chance they would cancel individual locations or wholesale test date cancellation?
My personal belief is that they would cancel the entire administration as opposed to doing this piecemeal.
Yeah, letting the people in Atlanta take, but the people in New York not, kind of thing.
Yeah, if they were to do that, I think that puts them in a really bad kind of like policy position. Oh, you were going to, let's say they canceled New York where things are a little bit more concerning than, say, Atlanta right now.
Sure.
Oh, so you're going to protect the New York students but not the Atlanta students?
Or
they don't want to,
or vice versa, give the Atlanta people the option to take, but prohibit New York.
Yeah, you don't want to get into that situation. And so I think for them, if they make the decision to pull it, they will go ahead and pull it for all locations. And it's got to be concerning when they see a university like Harvard cancel classes and say, we want you off campus within 5 days.
Yeah.
Which is outrageous, by the way. Can you imagine if you're a student who's, already spending every penny to be at Harvard, and now they're like, go take a vacation someplace. It's not like how life works. Or if you're an international student on a visa.
Oh, yeah.
They're like, hey, sorry. And that visa is required, them being in school is required for that visa. It's like, that wasn't a well thought out policy there, Harvard. Could have given them people a little bit more time, or at least access to avenues of mitigation.
Something, yeah.
Anyway, So that's not the funnest topic in the world, but I know it's on everybody's minds right now. And, the best thing you can do is keep studying, wash your hands, study some more, wash your hands. Which is apparently one of the best ways to protect yourself.
That's what I keep reading. So anyway,
let's dive into the main topic of the day.
Yeah, stay safe out there, guys. Let's talk logic games.
Yes, indeed. And I know you and I are both excited to talk about this. It's a question that we get all the time. So we've just been kind of waiting to get to it. And the topic is how to get faster at doing logic games. And I wish I could tell you that there's a super simple answer. It is simple in a lot of respects, but it doesn't mean it's not hard work. But the kind of prefacing comment I want to make is this is really about study habits and the steps that you take while preparing to get better and faster at logic games. In a later episode, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about specific logic games approaches inside the section when you are in real time to make decisions that will help you go faster, or at least to be as efficient and optimal as possible.
Yeah, the more strategic in the game decisions that you can make, almost techniques in that sense.
Exactly. Yeah. In a sense, it's a two-part discussion, but we're just not labeling it as such. This is more about how do I just become better at it and faster at it while I'm still preparing. That later conversation will be about how do I actually do it the right way when I'm inside the game.
Yeah.
So, Jon, what would you say is the starting point of this conversation?
Well, I think it's almost impossible not to begin with the advisement that you have to know the common forms, features, setups, game types, rules. You have to have a fairly deep repository of knowledge on the most consistent or the most predictable types of elements. What are you going to see? Do you know those pieces cold? That's what I think.
Yeah, I think I would have to agree with you. One of the things when you see people first start the LSAT is the games really catches them off guard and they don't know what to do. And because of that, they don't perform well. And so familiarity with what you're looking at has got to be the foundation for what you're doing. Now, getting familiar with all these elements doesn't happen quickly. It's going to take time. And getting faster, one big component of that is having like muscle memory, an instantaneous response. And I often say that to students that I'm talking to about getting faster. I'm like, when you see this, how long does it take you to analyze it and understand it? Hopefully the answer is hardly any time at all.
Sure.
Especially with logic games, which is so much about diagramming. That if you don't sit down and become good at those types of things and make it second nature, you're in real trouble.
Yeah, for the common content. We'll talk a little more about outlier situations later on, but it reminds me a lot, Dave, of the crystal ball webinars that we've done and how hard we drill down on the nature of what you are almost guaranteed to see in logic games every time. That's exactly right. That's what we're talking about here when we talk about common forms or common content.
When you think about it, we'll use like a linear game, for example. You know this is going to be on the test. You can see dozens and dozens and dozens of examples of this from prior LSATs that are different forms of it. Right. 6 variables, 7 variables, 5 variables. You don't want to take a bunch of time when you're first starting out on a logic game on the actual test and have to kind of contemplate what's the best way to approach this. You need to familiarize yourself with the things that are coming up the most and kind of get yourself to a point where you can recognize that's this and move on. And that includes everything, the setup, the game type, the setup for the game, how to diagram and handle individual rules, the common inferences that you see. These things can all be learned. They can all be drilled over and over again. And remember that like 95% of games are really standard. They only add some new pieces. They change the scenario a little bit. There's not as much outlier stuff as maybe people fear.
Right.
Because I know they fear the outliers. The other thing is you have to know the common approaches for things that don't appear as much. Numerical distributions. We've had game reviews where you literally are like, guys, follow the numbers and set it 20 times because that was the way to solve that particular section most optimally. I'm a big fan of like making big templates for the different possibilities in a game, and I do that more frequently than you do.
That's true.
but I already know all the elements that lead to that. When we talked about template games, we went through a whole list of elements that suggest that maybe the game should be templated. Mm-hmm. And so you need to know that. You have to go back and inform yourself about the basics, and then not just kind of become like, oh, I read that list, Dave, but more like, Dave, I can tell you what's on that list. Mm-hmm. And this is the real difference, is that somebody who is dedicated learns this to the point where they have memorized it. If I see a rule, I can automatically diagram it without thinking in almost every case. Unless it's a real outlier, and then I might stop and be like, what did they say?
Well, that's when, you bet your brain kind of thing. That's when you actually have to get a little creative. But the vast majority of this is not about creativity. It's not about spur-of-the-moment decisions. It's about, I know what to do right now. I've seen this. I'm familiar with it. I had a conversation earlier in the week with a student. We were talking about rule diagramming and linearity of all things. And it was one of those basic A before B. And I said, what does this tell us as an inference? And there was a 6, 7, 8 second beat before they were like, oh, A can't be last, B can't be first. And I was like, you have to be more automatic than that. That's instantaneous.
Yeah, there was a thing I used to do a long time ago when I took phone calls from like prospective students, and I ended up talking to them. And this was a long time ago when we weren't really well known. And a lot of times people would be like, well, how do I know you guys are any good? And I'd be like, man, I would just rub my hands and be like, let me show you. And one of the common things I would say was about logical reasoning. I'd be like, how do you weaken a causal argument? And then I would just wait.
Yep.
Because almost always what I got from students was at best a partial answer. And it would take a while. And I'd be like, this is a good example of the difference. I can tell you how to weaken a causal argument in the most common ways that they do it, just like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I can just read it out and know it because I actually know what those are. I know what they look like. It's second nature to me. The difference here is you're losing time because you have to stop and think about it. And that is uncertain for you and it's slow. And so it's the same thing in logic games. If you don't know all the game types and you have to stop and be like, is this a grouping game? Or is this, what kind of game is this? Is it advanced linear? Right. That's lost time and it's lost certainty, and you don't have the ability to go quickly. So you have to learn all of this first. And one of the things that we'll probably say again is you don't have to learn it fast.
Right.
Like this isn't something where I expect you in 5 days to know it all. You can take your time with it. You can go slowly. To go fast, you have to be able to do it at a slow pace first. A point that I'll make again a little bit later. So the ultimate goal with all of this is to recognize everything that is recognizable prior to the test and to be able to just respond to it instantly. If you're looking at the diagramming, the analogy that I often make is it's like driving a car. Mm-hmm. I remember the first time I drove a car. It was scary for all people involved. It got better slowly, and now I don't think about it, just like most people, and I'm a really solid driver. But think about the LSAT and logic games in the same way. If you study, say, the logic games Bible, I see this all the time. I've been studying it for 2 weeks, and I'm not any faster. I'm like, of course you're not. You haven't had enough time to absorb everything.
Right.
These days people want to just like read it super fast. They're like, I read everything. I'm like, reading it is not the goal here. Understanding it and knowing how to apply and implement it is the goal. It's a hugely different scenario with something that's academic and really challenging like this. So that's something to think about. Take your time with this. Make sure that you actually do know it. And if you need to, use things like flashcards.
Sure.
So that the stuff that you can know beforehand, you do know beforehand.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, it's strange to think that a test like this would have it happen. A lot of people seem to overlook the necessity of memorizing these elements or these pieces. You cannot memorize your way to a 180 on this test, but you have to build that bedrock of knowing these inside and out, knowing them cold, automatically, instantaneously.
Yeah, this is the basis of skill in any kind of thing.
Yeah.
You watch Roger Federer play tennis. How many backhands do you think he's hit in his lifetime in practice?
Yeah.
Thousands and thousands, millions really, in order to develop muscle memory so that when the time comes, he doesn't have to think about it. He just reacts and it looks like a physical thing.
Precisely. Yeah. You had to memorize what those different color lights were the first few times you were in a car. But now you see red and you stop. I hope.
That's exactly right.
Because again, it's automatic. That's what we're talking about here.
Know all those elements that I listed out before and be able to say, all right, I have learned this. That is the first step. Is it everything? No, it's not. The second thing is that builds depth of understanding. The next thing you have to do is create width of understanding.
Breadth, yeah.
Yeah, width and breadth, whatever. So, and that is to look at as many games as possible in order to learn all the variations. If you've seen 4 of the variations they have on a grouping setup, but you haven't seen the 5th, 6th, and 7th one, you're going to be slower when you run into those 5th, 6th, and 7th ones.
It just makes you vulnerable. And it's a lost opportunity. There is so much content out there that you can expose yourself to so that you are insulated against these subtle variations, these nuances.
Exactly. So do as many games as possible.
Exactly.
Go back and do the early games. I love watching people say things like, oh, you only need to do games from 70 and up or prep test 50 and up. And I always laugh because I think to myself, I'm really glad that those students are doing that because that gives us an opportunity with our students to say, don't do that. Learn those weird games from the past because they show up all the time. But some of the games from like, say, prep test 1 through 30 are not only really hard, they're really strange.
Yeah.
And just doing them is good for you. It's kind of like climbing a mountain. If you take the same path every day, you don't really get better at anything other than climbing that one path. But if you start varying it and trying different things, all of a sudden your skill set gets wider, your knowledge of that mountain gets wider, and that allows you the next time somebody says, all right, you're climbing this mountain, this is the route you have to go. You're going to be okay with that because you've learned all the different possibilities as opposed to being on just one path.
Yeah, I think about it sometimes like dialects of a language. The way that, like, Catalan Spanish versus Madrid Spanish. It's close, but different enough that if you really need to speak it as fluently as possible, you're going to want to have had conversations in both places. If that
kind of like Basque Country, Catalan is
yeah. Barcelona, they speak slightly differently there than they would in Madrid.
That's same thing's true in France. Parisians speak in one type of kind of accent, and then you go down south to like Provence, and it changes a little bit. And it's hard for me personally because I speak enough French to be conversant, but not fluent. To sometimes pick up the difference and follow it when you're traveling over there.
Isn't there a difference in the pronunciation of we and way? We're both we.
Southerners are a lot more way over there.
Yeah, but if you've heard both, you're good to go. You can still have that conversation. That's what this is. It's about becoming conversant by exposure.
Yeah, because if you're an American and you're in the south of France and they're like, way, you might just say, no way.
No way.
All right, let's move on to the next point.
Cool. You want to talk a little more about, this is broad understanding. Let's get a little narrower and talk about the rules themselves. Is that fair?
Yeah, one of the things is that when you get into the games themselves, a lot of times people say, well, now I've made my diagram, I'll just refer to my diagram constantly. And I understand that desire to rely upon that. You're like, this is a thing I've made. I trust it. It's a reflection of the game that I'm looking at. But one of the things that I think that is underrated is the ability to flash memorize what you have looked at. If somebody gives you a game and you go ahead and you diagram the 4 or 5 rules that are there, remember that what you're doing is you're taking a bunch of words and turning them into pictures.
Yeah.
That's really the process of diagramming it. And everyone's heard that phrase, like a picture is worth 1,000 words. It's because it's visual and it's powerful and it has the ability to imprint itself into your mind.
Yeah.
So if you can, you want to try to memorize those as much as possible so you don't have to refer back to the game constantly. And certainly don't go back to the original rule and reread that over and over again.
Yeah.
The only reason you should be doing that is if you've made a mistake.
That's precisely. I'm glad you brought that up because sometimes you might have to go back and reread a rule if something's going wrong. If multiple answers look right and none of the answers look right, you've made a mistake somewhere, then the rules might need a evaluation. But this is about your connection with the rules.
Which should be really strong, and your diagram should be really strong as well.
Yeah.
I know you have thoughts about like the power of your diagram as it conveys information.
Well, it's funny. I wish they were more original thoughts. Instead, I stole this from you years and years ago. I remember listening to you talk to a student and setting up this little drill where you took the game away from the person and all they had was their diagram, and you said, make the game for me. Give me all the rules. Give me the scenario just from your diagram. And that really struck me as powerful and probably scary for that poor student, because it means you better have it down. Your diagram better be as clear a distillation of what you've just seen to allow you to reverse engineer it.
Yeah, it strikes me that there's a drill that can be pulled out of this. And that I used to kind of deal with students. I'd be like, all right, we're making setups. We'd go through it. 2 or 3 weeks later, I'd be tutoring them. I'd be like, hey, pull out some of those setups that we made a couple weeks ago. Mm-hmm. And they'd pull them up and I'd be like, excellent. Now write out what the game was. And I don't care whether it was about 6 people in line or 6 ships coming into a cruise port. I don't care about those topical aspects. Right. I was like, did you capture all the rules? And what we found with some students was they had really good capture of the rules and they were able to recreate the game. And they were the ones who were doing really well. Mm-hmm. And then we found with other people, I'm like, you're missing pieces. You didn't show this, or you didn't have a clear understanding of it. Yeah. And sometimes it was hard to make that determination because it was like, well, S can't arrive 5th. I'm like, that's a hard rule to know that you've diagrammed it and that was an original rule, but you had it captured. And some students were like, I've missed so much here. I see what my problem is. I need to go back into the rules and really isolate and burn them into my memory so that, I've diagrammed them and now I remember them. And all of a sudden that is a great lesson to learn because you're like, I see what's happening. I'm not identifying with the rules as strongly as I should be.
That's precisely it. Yeah, how well did these resonate with me? And then how clearly did I represent them for later use? And again, with your diagram, you're going to have rules and inferences together. So, those not laws from A ahead of B, it's hard to tell sometimes a week later if that was a rule or an inference. That's okay, as I see it.
Yeah. Hopefully you have A, B with a block.
Or a dash,
over to the side.
Depending on how.
And you can figure out from there it must have been an A-B block rule that caused all of that. It's not a perfect drill, but if you're not good at this, it'll prove that very quickly. You'll be like, I'm missing a ton of this. And don't do it the next day when you're like, I probably remember the third rule was that, S was 7th. That's not what we're looking for. You're looking for honesty, which is probably a point that we don't have to talk about, but we really should. Be honest with yourself.
Yeah.
Sometimes people want to gloss it over and they're like, I'm pretty good at it. Or, I forgot that. I'm like, don't play that game with yourself. You're better than that. That's not the best way to improve.
Yeah, people want to make self-assessment into self-flattery. And that's really, I think, a distracting approach to it. That perspective is not that helpful. Self-assessments need to be, in your case, brutally honest, really, as you say.
I've said 100 times, it's all about being positive. You need to be positive. But if you're deluding yourself, that's not positive.
That's not good.
You got to be honest about what's actually happening. If you're like, look, I'm bad at this and I'm struggling, be like, okay, now that we know that, we can stop and focus on it and work on it. So now we've kind of gotten through the part here where we're like, know all the various features that are there. Acquaint yourself with the games, their types, the types of rules that you see, the inferences. Acquaint yourself with the diagramming. Be able to do it in second nature. Try to, identify with the rules so that you can flash memorize them and create a setup that is really powerful, that conveys all that information. What happens at that point?
Well, yeah, you talk about pulling out diagrams from stuff that had been done a week or 2 weeks or however long prior. And this is a really important idea of revisiting work that you've done previously. Repetition. You talk about muscle memory, you talk about Roger Federer's backhand. It's because he's done it a million times. It's because he continues to revisit and tweak and try to improve. So a big aspect of this, I think, is continuing to do the same game over and over and over. And it doesn't have to be back to back to back to back, but coming back to it and seeing how well you understand, how clear it hopefully still is, or how much clearer you can make it.
Exactly. The rule that I kind of talk about is that repetition equals speed. Mm-hmm. You have to repeat things. Doing a game once is very rarely going to be enough. And I realize that's incredibly annoying advice to hear. Because you're like, look, I finished that game. No, you're not done with it. because you finished it, but did you really learn from it? And in this podcast over the episodes, we've talked repeatedly about the idea of you have to do things more than once to make sure that you've really aced it. And that's what this is about. Repeat these games until you can do them without a hitch. Since day one of the things I noticed was that you have to do questions multiple times. Yeah. And that's because, and this is what really generated the teaching test that we've talked about before, is I was like, why do I know these questions so well? Well, part of it was because I liked what I was doing, but part of it was because I was teaching it to other people. Mm-hmm. And in order to teach it, you had to repeat the questions. Like I had to look at them more than one time to make sure I had all the details. And it slowly kind of coalesced, this was a long time ago, that I was like, these two things are really just the same as preparing. Yeah. I'm just preparing to teach, but really that's how students should be preparing anyway. So if you've done a game once and done well, fantastic. I don't think you have all the information from it, and I think you should do it again. If you've done a game once and you've struggled, you definitely need to come back to it. So, the idea of standardization is really what's kind of like allows you to do this and have it be of value here.
I think I can speak for both of us in saying it is exceptionally rare, even for two people like us who know this test as well as you can, to do things the first time and feel like, well, that is unimprovable. That's as good as it possibly could have been. I know everything there is to know about this. Mission accomplished.
Yeah, even if we get the big pieces right and have success on the game, I will think back and be like, I could have done that a little bit better. I could have been a little bit sharper here. Mm-hmm. And fortunately, it wasn't catastrophic, but you always want to engage in self-improvement and self-analysis that says, what could I have done better about this? And, you don't want to get complacent about this. Just because you've had 5 games in a row that you did well on, don't all of a sudden think to yourself, I'm done. This takes work. And this to me is like the actual, the sweat part of what you're doing. This is where you have to go through this and you have to drill again, and again. And the process, we've talked about it for years, and the kind of like phrase that we throw around is you have to perfect these games.
Right.
You have to get to a point where if I put it down in front of you, you can do it smoothly and quickly without a problem and without any stops or kind of like panic moments. You have to know it by second nature. That's a lot of work with some games. Yeah. Some of them it only takes twice. Some of them it takes 5 times. Some of them it may take more than that. And I'm not talking about doing them 5 times in a row. Do not do what at 2 o'clock and then be like, all right, at 2:10, I'm going to do it again. You can, but then don't come back at 2:20 and be like, I'm doing it again. Do this over a period of days, weeks, and months. And you will start to see that this repetition, this perfection process has a huge impact on your ability to absorb what's happening and to know what's going to happen in future games that you see in terms of what will actually come up next.
Yeah, this sense I sometimes get from people of like good enough, that's a really dangerous marker to set. It's got to be higher. Set a higher bar. Aim for perfect. Perfect in every sense. I immediately recognize this stuff. I immediately diagram these rules the right way. I made the inferences. I moved through the questions correctly. There's almost always something in hindsight or in repetition that you can improve. Look for those moments. Look for those opportunities.
And if you're like uncertain, if you actually have reached that stage, put the game away for a week.
Yeah.
Pick it up a week later and be like, am I able to do it seamlessly? Or do I struggle a little bit? Because if you struggle, you're not there yet. And in a sense, this is one of the hardest. This is what my dad would say, like, apply the elbow grease. This is where you got to work on it. And I'm like, it takes time. It can be really dull.
Tedious,
sometimes. Yeah, tedious. That's why I'm like, mix it up. That's why I also don't like people to kind of take an approach with like, I'm just studying logic games for 2 months. I'm like, well, that's good, but you're going to get bored and it's going to be something that your brain rebels against. So mix in reading comp and logical reasoning and keep yourself fresh topically. But one other thing here, it's not just about doing it over and over again and re-drilling it. Yes, that is a key thing. It's also about how you time yourself.
Yeah.
And I'm a big fan at first of not doing it timed. To start off and to take as much time so you're like trying to absorb everything and then to go faster the next time. At the very end, when you've perfected the game, you can do it within whatever the reasonable allotted time is and get it done perfectly. But there's no expectation. And also, and this is a really key thing from a test mentality standpoint, there is no pressure the first couple of times to get everything right or to do it really fast. There's an interesting story that I heard Tom Morello explain, the Rage Against the Machine guitarist. And he was at his music lesson. He had a new teacher that had to sub in. And the guy was like, show me your fastest riffs. And so Morello whipped out some fast riff that he had. And it was kind of weak, but, he missed some notes. But he's like, no. And the guy was like, you want to play fast, don't you? And Morello was like, yes, I want to be super fast. He's like, if you want to be fast, you got to be able to play slow first. And of course, Morello was like, what? I'm trying to play fast, bro, not slow.
Yeah.
And he's like, if you can't play it slowly, there is no way you're going to play it quickly and play it correctly and properly. So he said, slow down. And this is the way I want you to drill this. He gave him these different kind of riffs and figures to play. And he said, you play it slowly 100 times until you have it right. Then you go a little bit faster. And you've got to be able to play it 100 times in a row at that speed before you move to the next speed up. They had a metronome.
Yeah, I was going to say, I could see Tom sitting there with a metronome.
Yeah, you and I both play guitar. And so for us, I know this speaks directly to us. But I think the example works.
Yeah.
And Tom Morello's comment, and he's an ultra cool guy, was, at first I thought it was ridiculous. But as I did it, I began to realize I was missing so much before because I was trying to be fast. And what I was missing was the fact that when I was doing it slowly, I had to be precise. And what I was creating over time, according to him, was muscle memory.
Yeah.
So that now, after a long time doing this, and obviously this is a physical process, your brain moves quicker than and learns faster than the muscles in your fingers. Yeah. Now the dude is super fast. He's like lightning. But he's like, it all came because I needed to learn to play slow before I played fast.
Yeah, he's super fast, but he does not miss a note.
God, he's so good.
He's so good. It's a really counterintuitive thing to even begin to get your head around, that you want to go faster, start slower. Because speed in this case, and I think a lot of people misunderstand this, speed is a product of how well you understand this, how well you recognize and respond to things. Speed doesn't exist on its own. It's an outcome.
Yeah. You don't start fast. You got to do other things in order to get fast.
Yeah. And the faster you try to start, the more I think it ultimately holds you back, because by definition, in a way, you're going to miss notes. You're going to miss key elements.
And all of a sudden, your final performance suffers.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I said before when I see people, come to me and they're like, I've been reading your book for 2 weeks and it hasn't helped. I'm like, you're trying to run before you walk.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that as an insult. What I mean is slow down, take your time on this, because this isn't easy. Anyone who says to you, oh, the LSAT's easy, A, they're a jerk. B, they're pretty much lying. Or C, they're like some ultra genius that just happens to come to and what have you, and I don't care about them. They're irrelevant for our purposes.
Yeah, that's not our audience here at all. So
they're not even real people for the most part. Everybody I know has had to do at least a little bit of work to get to a really high level, and a lot of people have had to do a tremendous amount of work. And the typical person is on the I had to do a tremendous amount of work to get there.
For sure, but I can tell you this, if there's a unifying characteristic of people who do well, it's they started with this foundation of slow-paced, deep dive understanding and repetition, as you say.
Yeah, which kind of crystallizes to the idea at the very end is, at first, don't worry about time. Don't put extra pressure on yourself. You don't need to. You're going to be fine if you keep working hard. It will pay off. It might not pay off in the first 2 weeks. It may take longer than that. You may start to see increases after a long period of nothing happening. That's all right. Maintain positivity. Keep working. Know that you're doing the right thing. The one kind of final point that goes with this is a lot of times people ask me about the 8:45, 8 minutes and 45 seconds per game. And the thing that I always say to them is general rule. I don't follow it.
It's an average.
I follow it in general, but if there's a game that I can do faster, I'm doing it faster than that. And if I need to use that extra time later on, I'm going to go ahead and use that. And if I've got a game with 7 questions, I'm not worried about 8:45. Maybe I'll take 9:45.
Right.
So don't get tied up with, oh man, I did it in 9 minutes, but 8:45 is what I was supposed to do it. That's okay. All right. The idea is to get through as many questions as possible in the 35 minutes and be able to have the highest level of accuracy. So don't get caught up in the clock, especially when you are first starting out. I know that's the end point, and it's really desirable in your mind to be like, I can run this marathon and I can run it in 2 minutes. Or 2 hours.
I was going to say, my goodness.
The greatest marathon ever. 2 minutes. No, you're going to run it in 2 hours. If I ask you to run a marathon tomorrow, you're going to start off slow and slowly work your way up, and it's going to take time. It's not going to happen in just a couple of weeks or a couple of months. Yeah. It's all right.
The 8:45 is a useful benchmark, but it's not a strict or rigid cutoff point. Nor does this, and again, I want to just make sure we're really clear on this for people. There's a difference between untimed understanding and passivity. This doesn't allow you the opportunity to be complacent or to sit back and expect the test to come to you. You still have to be aggressive, but aggressive in how you deconstruct it, not necessarily in how closely you watch the clock up front.
Yeah. During the actual test.
Especially during the test, yeah.
In a future episode, your mindset's totally different. This is practice. And if you don't time yourself, but you're lazy about it, that's one thing. If you're trying to go fast, or at least trying to learn it, depending upon what your focus is, that's fine. At least do it with purpose. Have purposeful studying that you are engaged in, where you're trying to learn something and take away lessons from what you're looking at. Every single LSAT question will teach you some type of lesson. It may reinforce one that you've previously learned, but that's okay too, because that builds that mental muscle memory that you need to go faster and faster.
Yeah, which is precisely why we're encouraging people to revisit games in the first place.
Yeah. And that's a really key thing, is come back to things later on, especially things that you found that were really hard or reminded you of certain patterns, or that later on you encountered something similar and had difficulty with. You know, if you're like, this is just another linear game and I feel confident with it, great. Don't spend that much time with it. Glance at it, make sure you're comfortable with it, know that you could have done well on it. That's not where you spend the majority of your time. That harder game that really gave you fits, that's the one to sit and really deep dive until you know for sure that there's no problem whatsoever.
Yeah.
So,
precisely.
Yeah, kind of a key thing. You've got to come back and revisit. Don't just, if you're taking an LSAT in June and it's March and you're like, all right, I'm done with that, maybe come back and look at it in May really briefly and make sure that you're still on top of it. That kind of situation.
Yeah. So you start with untimed or perhaps very liberally timed, but obviously the end goal here is to be able to do this at a test day speed. What happens when you do start to be more mindful of the clock? What's the best way to actually apply a timing regimen to this?
Well, I think the first thing is to understand where you're spending time. And whether or not the time that you're spending is the wisest place to spend it. And, again, this is about practice. But one of the things that I have often asked students when I first work with them in, say, reading comprehension or logic games is, well, how long did it take you to read the passage? Or how long did it take you to work through the rules and make a setup that you felt comfortable with? And is that the only question I ask them? No. There's going to be a lot more depending upon the different answers I get. But that's the first kind of basic marker. Track how much time it takes for you to read the game, to set up the game, how much time it takes for the questions. Are there any types of questions that you seem to be slower at?
Yeah, I ask students that question all the time after they finish our game set. Which of those questions took the longest and how long did it take? And almost inevitably they look at me cluelessly. I don't know, 14 felt like, and I'm like, no. You need to actually know these time markers to see what you're getting, what bang for your buck, so to speak, what you're getting for this investment.
It's actually one of the things that I really love about our digital testing platform.
Yeah.
Is that we had it on the back end and we could see the time for a while, but we finally, I don't even know if finally is the right word, we enabled it for students to see. And it is wild to watch somebody go through a section and look at it afterwards and be like, yeah, you spent 6.5 minutes on question 14. And they're like, what? Now, in logic games and reading comprehension, it can be a little bit misleading because the first question in each section or each game is the one where they're making the setup.
Right.
So you see like these markers. It's not just that question 7 took a long time. It's that they were making a setup. But I've watched students where I'm like, in a logic game, they're like 3.5 minutes on that question. Was it worth it? And they're like, well, I didn't get to the last 5, so no. I'm like, exactly. But that's feedback. That's, one of the benefits of the way we have our system set up. Unfortunately, LSAC's new subscription program, which I think is super cool, has nothing in the way of analytics. It's just your answers. It's not that helpful.
You can bet your boots that LSAC's tracking how long you spend on the questions, though.
I hate that.
I do too.
They're just gathering information that they can continue to use against people in the future. I'm like, the digital world, it's like surveillance. Well, there's all these positives, and then there's really bad things about facial recognition and surveillance.
Right. Yeah, I've brought that specific point up. They're tracking what answers people pick and how long these questions take and where it is that the traps are best laid. And people don't tend to think about this as they immerse themselves into LSAC system, but man, you're feeding the enemy some good data.
Yeah. Oh, we see that people continue to struggle with evaluate questions.
Right.
Let's have some more of those on a future LSAT.
Yeah, I wonder why answer choice D, which was wrong, trapped so many people. Let's make more answers like that.
That's exactly right. You feed the beast.
Feed the beast.
If you do that with our system, you only feed us.
Yeah.
So the cool thing about it is that while LSAC has like 70 LSATs available, they don't have, the other 20 or so that are floating around out there. So if you want to take tests that they haven't done, you can get that timing feedback and so forth.
Yeah.
But I have found that working with students, in talking to, someone comes to me and says, I've had a problem. They want some feedback. I can look at those results and think, wow, this is just a wealth of information that I couldn't have gotten 2 years ago. So I absolutely love that.
I do too. It's powerful, man.
Yeah, but that's a good thing. You have to look at those things on your own. Where did I spend the time? Am I running into a question where every time I see this type of question, like an accept question, I've lost an extra 30 seconds? Because it may be that's the case. Track yourself with those types of things and look at it, because you need to take note of the time that you spend in each area, how much that costs you, and whether or not you get the ultimate reward for that time expenditure.
Yeah, put another way, speed exists in a whole lot of different, like a full spectrum here. It exists in how long it takes you to read something or make a setup or diagram rules, draw inferences, down to the individual questions, but for the section as a whole as well. If 1 or 2 questions cost you 5 or 6, man, you're making some really poor choices.
Well, it reminds me of a class I taught years ago where I had a really very capable student, and he had the ability to score in the 170s, but he had these practice tests where all of a sudden it was 161, 162. Great scores, but we already knew that he could score in the 170s. And so I would watch him when he took practice tests. And this was like a room of like 20 or 30 people, and I'd be walking around and I would watch him. And I knew that we were about to do a practice test where the first game had a really kind of weird setup and it just took a little bit more work than the usual first game. And what we had identified was that when he got himself into a game that he didn't understand, he just stopped.
Yeah.
He'd just sit there and stare at it. And so the game starts, and the test starts, and what does he do? He gets lost in the first game, and I could just see the time ticking away. And finally, after a while, I just tapped on the desk, and I was like, look at my watch. I'm like, you just screwed yourself, And it was a really harsh lesson for him. Although I had to admit, I enjoyed doing that.
That's pretty funny. Yeah, you fixate, you freeze, and suddenly you're getting nothing back for the time that elapses.
Yeah, and I had told him, I was like, if you see something that isn't comfortable to you, jump to the next game. It's easy to do that. Well, he couldn't do it. He couldn't get over his mindset of like, I must fight my way through this. I'm like, you are winning the war and losing the battle. This is not what I call the best approach. Sometimes you sacrifice pieces on the chessboard in order to win the game. You don't want to do that. You don't want to lose a piece, and so you will lose the game.
Yeah, it's a tough lesson to teach. It's a stinging lesson to experience.
It was not that tough to teach it in that instance. It had been tough all the way up to that point, but when it actually happened, I was like, this is actually a golden teaching moment.
I suppose it's tough to impart on people because, again, it's just a hard thing. It's an instinct that's tough to shake.
I needed the perfect moment to do it, but the beautiful thing was it resonated deeply with him thereafter, and he didn't have that problem.
Yeah.
He was able to, like, if I'm in trouble, I'll just push it to the end. I'm like, now we have learned what we needed to learn.
Yeah. And we're going to talk a lot more about this type of strategy, these types of in-the-moment decisions in the second half, or whatever it turns into, of this type of games speed discussion too. So, yeah, we'll definitely cover these ideas in more depth.
Yeah, and I think if you go back through this episode, it sounds very general. It's actually not. There's a lot of actionable advice in here where it's like, you need to learn this, you need to become familiar with this. And there's plenty of resources for that, whether it's taking tests or, something like a course or tutoring or the Logic Games Bible. There are tools out there where you can say, I can learn each part of this and learn how to get better.
Yeah.
The one thing that I will close with is the idea that this is probably not going to be an easy process. Hopefully you like games and you really get into them, which is, I know how you and I feel,
Sure.
but not everybody feels that way. It's going to take work. So accept that up front, embrace it, realize that you don't need instantaneous progress in order to be making actual progress. But the most important thing is, if you don't get immediate improvement, that's okay. Don't get down about it. It takes time. Everyone will tell you that. Just keep working at it. It's the old kind of saying is, if you want to make a hole in a stone, one drop every minute over time will actually do that.
Sure.
If you take a whole bucket of water and throw it on the stone, nothing happens.
Yeah.
So work at it.
We've both seen the Grand Canyon. Our little river made that. It's pretty. It took a while. I think students are miscalibrated, or they qualify the nature of what improvement really means incorrectly. Where what I try to tell people is, look, if you go to bed tonight, even incrementally better than you woke up this morning, that's a great LSAT day. You learned a rule, you corrected a mistake, you moved a little quicker or made a strategic choice in the questions. Sleep easy. You're making progress.
Yeah. And also realize that unlike, say, a history test, where you learn a set of facts for the most part, you do learn interpretations
Sure.
and so forth. But if you learn 50% of the facts, you usually see like a 50% jump in your score. And if you learn 100% of the facts, then you usually are getting most of the test right. That's not the LSAT. The LSAT is a process test. It's not fact-based like that. There are factual things you have to know and learn,
Right.
So you need to learn those. But it's about recognizing processes and reasoning forms, and that's a lot squishier, really is the right word for that. It's a lot squishier than just like, what year was this war? When did Parliament vote for this particular taxation act, and so forth?
Yeah, that was my you can't memorize your way to a 180 point. You need to have that foundation, but this is about skills. These types of skills take time. But if you're a little more skillful day after day, you'll get there.
It means that there's not a straight line response. You don't study for 1 hour and get this much better. It means that you will plateau. And sometimes those plateaus can last several weeks. It's normal. Don't freak out. Maintain positivity. This is a test that you can get better at. Keep working at it and you will get better. I have full confidence that you can do that.
Well, then we agree.
Excellent. Any final points, John? Or was that the final point?
I think that probably is the final point. It's always nice to end on a note of positivity.
I'm feeling good, man. It's my birthday. That drink was excellent, by the way.
You should be feeling good. I haven't made it very deep into this tequila Red Bull, but I suppose I've got all afternoon.
I have some advice for you with that tequila and Red Bull.
Pour it out?
Yes. I was going to say throw it away, but pour it out is just as good, man.
It's probably good advice.
I think I am going to have another one of these.
I love it.
I like Malibu. I don't love it by itself, but with other, rums and drinks, it's really good. This is tasty. I'm going to go have some more.
I wish I could be up there celebrating with you, buddy, but have some fun for me.
Next time, man.
It's a date.
Next time.
It's a date.
All right. If you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or YouTube, or any other place you find it in the world. Give us a rating. And if you have any questions, you can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. We would love to hear from you. On behalf of John and myself, have a great week, and we will talk to you soon.